Welcome. We've been waiting 3 weeks for this moment. This is the environmental
environment and
management. I always want to call it environment and sustainability, but it's the environment and management program. And the course is governance for sustainability and soft systems methodologies. We've spent the past 3 weeks looking at a case study, and I really want to welcome our guests that are here from both the CRD as well as a former colleague and member of the provincial government who came and actually gave us this case, participated and gave their insights, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys have come up with. So I'm going to turn it over to you now. We are filming, so if you're not interested in being filmed, it's basically going to be shot from the back here. So you will remain anonymous. But we are recording it for the purposes of being able to share it with the folks that we've been interacting with, future classes, and past classes who are also very interested in where this case study is at. So without further ado, let's begin.
Thanks, Derek. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much. Just a couple housekeeping things before we get started, as there are a few guests in the room. If you're looking for an exit, you can get out on either side, right or left. If you're looking for a washroom, they're also just kind of in this hall right behind me, so either exit will get you there. There's also a kitchen. If you need to refill some water, or grab a little drink or anything like that, that's a great place to do it. We also have a shakedown earthquake drill at 10:17. We're going to try our level best to be finished at that time. Hopefully, fingers crossed. It all depends on how many questions you have for us. But we're going to try to be out of here by then. If we're not, by any chance, don't be alarmed at the warning bells. It is pre-planned. No one's going to get hurt, hopefully. Okay. With that said, I'd like to start you off with a story. So I invite you all to close your eyes and think about this for a moment if you feel so comfortable. Imagine yourself in a park. Imagine yourself surrounded by this natural beauty and surrounded by nature and the biodiversity that is just quietly working away in the background as it does. This park is something that in many First Nations traditions, humans are fundamentally a part of rather than apart from. And it continues to work for us in its own ways. As long as we provide for it, it provides for us. I encourage you to think of the cedar tree, for example. In the Masonic tradition, the cedar tree can be stripped of its bark, can have planks removed, and yet it still grows and is still able to stand strong. That tree will still continue to provide shade and habitat for those that rely on it. However, that version of a park is a very colonial construct. That's not a term that is typically used in First Nations traditions. The colonial construct of a park is something that does not necessarily respect the intrinsic value of that space. And so what we're talking about today, that journey that we'd like to go on, is an exploration of how the First Nations communities in this region can be more actively engaged and involved in the management of parks and protected spaces in the Capital Regional District. So with that said, I encourage you to open your eyes, and I'd like to invite Taylor to the podium to give us a little walkthrough about what today's going to look like.
Thank you, Claire. I'm just going to take this opportunity to also introduce our panelists today. So we have Craig and Alyssa over here. You've met Claire. We have Avery, Julie, and Dan. We come to you today, as Derek said, as second-year Masters of Environment and Management students. As a part of our government and systems courses this year, we were challenged to consider how might First Nations become more directly involved in the management of parks and protected areas in the Capital Regional District. As a class, we chose to focus on the governance of parks and protected areas as it relates to the CRD and the Sauk First Nation. breaking into teams to explore a number of different perspectives to be able to provide some tangible results. In clarifying our approach to this project, we created a mission statement. We are a group of innovators, passionate about building meaningful relationships, identifying priorities that matter, and embracing change to better ourselves and our communities. As students at Royal Roads, we come from a variety of backgrounds and geographies. We acknowledge that we were only able to scratch the surface of this complex question and its underlying systems during our time here. We hope, however, that our unique circumstance allows us to provide some new perspective or ways of framing old ones. Over the last 3 weeks, we conducted broad internet searches. We scanned many documents, and we were able to connect with over a dozen individuals from the organizations we focused on through interviews and conversations. We worked to synthesize our findings and came to the conclusion that by collaborating on parks and protected areas in the CRD region, we can illuminate common values and shared priorities for a renewed land ethic that collectively supports First Nations self-determination, prosperity, and relationship to land and water. For today's panel, we will guide you through the collective journey of our research, and we'll be offering opportunities throughout to engage with the material as we share. Notice that we have a mic runner, the most handsome man in the crowd, who will bring you the mic so that your voice can be heard. First, we will take some time to explain the current perspectives of the various actors involved in the complex management system of parks. We will then share some insights into the new vision we have for parks. And lastly, we will look at a number of actionable recommendations that can serve as a way forward. At the end of each of these sections, Claire and myself will open the floor to questions that we will direct to the panelists. To be cognizant of time restraints, we may not get to every question and may limit follow-up questions or comments, but we welcome you to stay after our closing to continue the conversation until you are shaken out of the building.
So as Taylor mentioned, we did divide up into teams to really kind of dig deep into this issue. So the 5 teams considered a variety of different actors. So we considered this project from the perspective of the various participatory individuals and stakeholders at the table. And so examples include the province of BC, the Capital Regional District, the district municipality of Souk, the Selk First Nation, and a range of NGOs that cover a couple different buckets. So we looked at indigenous perspectives, we looked at recreation, we looked at habitat, and we looked at arts and culture. Those are the 4 thematic areas that we looked at for NGOs with respect to this issue. So with that said, I'd like to open the floor to the panelists to give a brief overview of these different actors. So if Liz could start us off, please and thanks.
Thanks, Claire. So yeah, I'm going to be just starting with the province of BC and the CRD. So the province of BC's role in governance is multifaceted. Its role, in part, is to support local governments, not-for-profit organizations, and residents, as well as to focus on effective protection and management of BC's water, land, air, living resources, and is involved in the administration and stewardship of Crown land, including all provincial parks. All ministries are mandated by the principles of the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. With regards to these mandates, the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation works towards negotiating treaties, land claims, and revenue sharing. And under the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, all staff are now required to go through a cultural training program regarding reconciliation principles when working with First Nations communities. The province has existing formal collaborative management agreements with First Nation governments in over 40 provincial parks. Underneath the provincial government lies the CRD, the Capital Regional District, a regional governing body which coordinates agency among 13 municipalities and 3 electoral areas and includes the management of regional parks and electoral area community parks. The CRD is governed by a 24-member board comprised of 1 or more elected officials from each local government within the CRD. They make decisions regarding services and delivery via votes which are often allocated to each board member based on population size of their municipality or electoral area. Like the province, the Capital Regional District has also made strides towards reconciliation, recently adopting a statement of reconciliation, which they have reflected these values in their corporate plan and priorities up until 2022. The province administers the Local Government Act, also known as the LGA, and the Community Charter, which is the enabling legislation that governs the actions of local and regional governments like the CRD, and this is considered a formal relationship. When it comes to involving First Nations more directly in the management of parks, the CRD is gridlocked by the Local Government Act and has minimal ability to create co-management or co-governance structures that can include First Nations governments. And this represents a barrier to fully achieving reconciliation. 3 of its main limitations include the fact that co-ownership of regional land is prohibited. Involvement at the board level is only afforded to First Nations communities that have made their way through the modern treaty process. And lastly, enforcement limitations within delegated authorities, mostly pertaining to creating bylaws and imposing remedial action. And it is important to note a new Reconciliation Act is soon to be tabled by the province, and it could bring these principles and calls of action into law.
Thanks so much, Liz. That's great. Craig, if you could have a little bit of an overview of your actors, thanks.
Thank you, Claire. Among the actors that our class considered was the Souk municipality and the Sauk First Nation. Among those interviewed by the 2 teams assigned to consider the perspectives of these actors was the Chief Administrative Officer Norm McInnes of Souk and the Head Planner Ivy Campbell in Souk, and Sauk Chief Gordon Planis and Tribal Council Member Alan Planis. The Souk municipality has a population of about 14,298 people and has grown at a rate of 4.6% between 2016 and 2018. It has 5,800 hectares, and 1,041 of those hectares are park land. The key players in the Souk municipality include Souk Community Association, the Sauk First Nation, Juan de Fuca Community Trail Society, Souk Bike Club, CRD Parks, the Land Conservancy, School District Number 62, Juan de Fuca Parks and Recreation Commission, Province of BC, and other NGOs. There are a number of barriers that were considered. Excuse me, and issues considered, wide range of user groups and interests, access limitations due to geography, lack of connectivity and fragmentation, uncertain future about provincial parks within the district, present legislation and governance structure, and capacity and resources, social values, current relationships with First Nations. In the interview with Gordon Planis and Alan Planis of the Sauk First Nation, a number of issues were also raised. As you're probably aware, the Sauk First Nations territory includes, in addition to including the entire municipality of Souk, includes the Sea-to-Sea Regional Park, the Souk Mountain Provincial Park, Souk Potholes Provincial Park. And so there are a number of issues, obviously, of great concern to the Sauk First Nation within this area. The Gordon Planis mentioned, among other things, a desire to see their right or to the Smokehouse Lakes, Shields Lake, Grassy Lake, and Crabapple Lake recognized. Eventually, they're in the treaty process, and so that was one of the major issues. They wanted to explore the opportunity for cultural camps in these areas, as well as day hikes and things of that nature that they could conduct in cooperation with the CRD.
Thanks, Craig. And finally, Avery, could you give us a picture of the NGOs?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. So I find that the importance of NGOs are often overlooked in society, yet they exist because we have a social or environmental gap that needs to be filled. So this is why we chose to focus as a class on NGOs as one of the actors we wanted to cover. A lot of the NGOs working in the area have a very diverse background, and we assess that potential against the opportunity for them to support co-management of parks. So one of the things that I think was really important of the NGOs that we did look into is that they have a very broad reach, ranging all the way up to international in nature. And this also was able to help us inform the research and the scope in which we integrated the opportunity for NGOs to be involved in the collaborative process of co-management. So I'm just going to go over again really quickly some of the NGOs that we did look into. From the First Nations and cultural perspective, we did some work and interviewed the Indigenous Perspective Society, We also spoke with the Habitat Acquisition Trust, who represent the environmental perspective, the Souk Arts Council, who represent arts perspective, and then we talked to 2 recreational nonprofits. One was called the Souk Bike Club, and the other the Juan de Fuca Community Trail Society. I love how they always have such long names. And so one of the things we did assess was the nature of the relationships that the NGOs had within the community. And some of those were formal and some of those were informal in nature. And in general, with all the NGOs, the most common formal relationship tended to be with funders, with pre-existing funders, some of whom were government, such as Souk, provincial and capital regional district. But there was a lot of informal relationships that existed as well. And based on some of our conversations, the nature of those informal relationships came from the value of relationships that they'd built with community members, and specifically through volunteer opportunities. For example, the Juan de Fuca Community Trails Society has quite a large network of volunteers who support the development of trails that the entire purpose is to connect community members more with nature and have more of a love and compassion to protect it. And I think it's really important to touch on some of the barriers that these NGOs are facing, just in a bit more capacity quickly here. So one of the biggest ones, of course, is the lack of financial support. They're filling this gap that I mentioned that exists, yet we don't give them a lot of money to do that. There's also a lack of time to accomplish desired goals. A lot of folks are volunteer. A lot of entire NGOs are completely volunteer run with no paid staff. So time is a huge issue. And then there's the physical and technical resources. So if you don't have the gear to build the trail or the art supplies to do the art, it's really hard to move forward. And sometimes that takes a lot of time to implement some of the projects they want to. And then also lack of collaboration. And I think that speaks to the nature in which nonprofits are often overlooked for their capacities to support the community and be a real key player in something such as co-management of parks. And yeah, all this means that, not a lot can get done with the NGOs in a limited amount of time, even if they have the best of intentions. So thank you. That's all I have for now.
Okay, and if there are no further comments from the panel, everybody's looking pretty good. So at this time, I'd like to open it up to the audience. If there's anybody in the audience that would like to follow up on anything respect to the actors or the current framework of this system, we'd love to take some time to break that down with you. Hearing none, I hope that means that you're saving all your questions for the interesting stuff.
So we're going to lead you into our vision now. Through our exploration of the actors immersed in the current structure, we identified a shared set of themes that are representative of the system that promotes greater equality and inclusion of First Nations. We have high-level, aspirational vision that is applicable to the governance structure of parks and protected areas within the CRD. It is our belief that the actors can achieve this vision through a genuine desire for change and a commitment to collaborative process. So I would like to invite Jules to please describe a bit about parks as an ecological and cultural landscape.
Thank you very much, Taylor. So commonly, when we think about parks, we think about recreational areas. We think about conservation areas. We think about going to have a picnic with our family or bird watching or going for a hike or just being in time with nature with tall trees and rushing rivers. It's a place to retreat, to kind of like a slice of paradise amongst the concrete, the buildings, the farm fields, and the highways that surround us. But beyond these important recreational values, parks can also be a beacon of ecological protection, for sure, and even beyond that, vibrant cultural landscapes. So that when we say the phrase cultural landscapes, we're speaking to the idea of where parks can be a place where actively traditional practices and uses can thrive and grow within those spaces. And cultural landscapes actually prioritize the traditional uses as a core service of parks, on par with conservation and recreation. So as much as we expect to see well-maintained trails, well-maintained facilities at parks, we would expect to see, walking through a park where there's sustainable harvesting taking place, or cedar bark stripping, or elders engaging in ceremony. And we see this as a way to transform how people see other and raise societal acceptance to build a sense of appreciation for the cultural importance of land and waters for Indigenous peoples and First Nations communities. So we envision a place where parks are considered a cultural landscape, and this becomes as normal as walking your dog within a park or going on a hike. And it becomes impossible to imagine a park that isn't planned, operated, and co-governed through First Nations perspectives, respecting traditional ecological knowledge and practices as essential to all parks. We envision that this shared approach in the management of parks will offer an opportunity to initiate healing by providing a place to strengthen our societal and ecological connections. And I want to kind of tie this together with a quote from Umberto Maturana, which is, "The way to heal a living system is to connect it to more of itself." And so this is what parks can demonstrate in the way of within bounds of park systems. But we think this could spread to how we treat our land and waters as a whole. And so I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Dan to elaborate on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jules. And thanks to everyone for being here today and our guests. It's great to see everyone here this morning. I know it's pretty early, but I really want to talk about the next piece of what our vision is for parks and this part of the world. So we see parks as a microcosm for truth and reconciliation on the landscape, where we can catalyze renewed land ethic beyond the boundaries of a park. So just a little bit about what we mean by a land ethic. I'll just pull a quote from Aldo Leopold. Land ethic is a philosophy or theoretical framework about how ethically humans should regard the land. So that's from the Sand County Almanac, written in 1949. So with keeping that in mind, we're looking for societal acceptance and awareness of the benefits of reconciliation, self-determination, and shared prosperity with a connection to the land. So parks and protected areas within the CRD currently exist and function with a colonial construct that has, in many instances, cut First Nations ties to the land and punished those who sought to retain them. Acknowledgement of these actions can help begin to address this issue, along with the awareness that reconciliation through connection to land and water, self-determination, and shared prosperity provide a host of positive benefits for all the actors involved and for society at large. Shared prosperity can help lift marginalized communities out of adversity, increase operational capacity, social capital, and create a positive feedback loop of fortune and happiness. Self-determined and self-sustaining First Nations communities provide economic gains to the region while simultaneously embedding our collective culture with hope and optimism. Societal awareness and acceptance of these truths are paramount to our vision and to our recommendations, which we'll go into more very soon. The ideas of reconciliation, self-determination, and the belief in shared prosperity must not exist in government ideals and vision statements alone. Rather, it is all actors' responsibilities to be the driving force behind awareness and acceptance, to recognize First Nations voices are numerically dampened and create an appetite for this social change within our communities. So part of our vision has to do with the mutual benefits for everybody. Healthy, uncontaminated landscapes and waters are part of those mutual benefits, while also sustainably harvesting our resources. So our vision to raise the public's awareness on the mutual benefits that truth and reconciliation can offer must be seen by all communities. It is our belief that if approached with respect and empathy, these differences will reveal shared commonalities that can be leveraged to achieve the collective goals of all actors concerned with the management of parks and protected areas for the benefit of present and future generations. We all agree on the value of unpolluted waterways, oceans, and landscapes. These values are mirrored in the ideals of reconciliation and our vision for the management of not only parks and protected areas, but also current and historically productive cultural places that have lost these values. By moving towards reconciliation, we can begin to overcome the shackles of colonialism through the mutual benefits of a clean environment we are all striving for and that we all value. Reconciliation can also be a restoration of our communities and our environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan and Julie, for sharing that wholesome vision of equity that incorporates inclusion and cultural practice. If any of our other panelists would like to add any comments to that, now's the time. And if not, we'd love to invite the audience to pick away a bit. Oh, Julie's got a little bit more to say, so I'll let her speak first.
Excellent. Thanks, Taylor. And just to expand on Dan's concept of a renewed land ethic, I thought I would maybe unpack this a little bit more. So when we think about ethics and how we present ourselves in the world and how we interact with others and what is our value system, what is our moral compass, and we think about land, we think about how land has been sort of carved up and fragmented and parceled into different uses. The same way we've sort of carved up these ethical imperatives of the ecological, the economic, and social values that we hold. So a renewed land ethic would almost bring together those three imperatives across the land base, instead of parsing out this piece of land is for economics, this piece of land is for ecological preservation, and this piece of land is for our social and cultural activities. So the vision of a renewed land ethic would be to kind of bring those three imperatives together across the landscape, no matter what piece of land that you're on. So this is a very big, lofty vision, but it's good to sort of hold that out in front of us as we sort of strive for this renewed way of interacting with the land and each other.
Thanks, Julie, for your clarification. If Julie didn't just answer your question and you have anything else you'd like to ask, now's the time. Our mic runner's up. All right.
Hi guys, thank you. I was hoping maybe you guys could talk a little bit about maybe like conflicting priorities, how this renewed land ethic and parks as an ecological landscape work in a situation where maybe First Nations want to harvest something that the CRD wants to strictly protect. Can we maybe elaborate on how that would work?
I'm jumping at the bit.
I can go? Yeah, I don't want to take all the airtime here, however, so maybe I'll launch and that'll trigger other panel members to jump in as well. So I guess it comes back to this concept of not perceiving, First Nations uses and non-Indigenous uses as other or separate. The idea is hopefully we would come to a place where parks are viewed where, the concepts of cultural uses are on the same playing field and maybe even potentially elevated from uses of recreation, for an example. So the idea is it's kind of this rising tide of prosperity. If First Nations communities are able to, practice cultural sustainable harvesting, if they're able to engage in ritual and ceremony, in teachings of traditional ecological knowledge within these spaces, then that enables their communities to thrive economically and culturally, but the surrounding neighboring communities are also able to thrive and engage from that raised prosperity of their neighbors. So, the ultimate vision is not to see the shellfish harvesting on this beach or the cedar stripping from this tree is taking away from non-Indigenous uses, but it's complementing and adding and kind of reinforcing that we're all in this together on like a rising tide of prosperity is one way to look at it.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Jules.
Anyone
And
else to
Claire's
add?
got something to say as well.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. So I think that that's a great point, Jules, about the three imperatives. And I think really what we're trying to do here, what our vision ultimately comes down to, is a balance of those three imperatives. And so using parks and protected spaces as a jumping off point, as a starting point for how we might be able to move forward in balancing these imperatives across the entire landscape, rather than just in these parts, because we talk about not fragmenting uses, but using even the term park or the jurisdictional boundary of a park is still creating fragmentation. So how can we use these learnings and these teachings as a way to consider how we might be able to treat the land holistically, moving beyond that boundary of a park? And so to speak directly to your question about competing uses, I think Jules did a really good job of kind of summarizing how we have to get out of that mindset on focusing on one or the other and being able to balance them. But I think further to that, we need to consider the sustainable aspect, the sustainability aspect of using resources, right? Because if we collectively as people are using our resources sustainably, there is no reason why those things can't happen in harmony and collaboration. So even just going back to the cedar tree example from earlier, if you're only removing enough bark to meet your needs, but leaving enough for the tree to still live, there is no reason why those uses can't exist in harmony. And so considering that and considering our use of resources in a way that makes sure that we are protecting those cultural values and also protecting those resources for those to come after us.
Great. And one last comment from Craig.
And I just wanted to mention, in our research involving the Sauk First Nation, they have adopted a land use code already. And I know other First Nations have done the same, the Haida Land Use Vision, or known as Haida Love. So First Nations are being very proactive in developing visions and codes that incorporate their values into the land management. So I don't think there is a conflict between the CRD's goals to manage these lands sustainably, or BC Parks goals to manage these lands sustainably, and First Nations. There's a way to incorporate the First Nations into the process and incorporate their values into the management. And they're actually, many of these First Nations, or including the Sauk here in the CRD, are being very proactive about that right now. So,
Great. Thank you all, and thank you for the question. I think we have one more.
Hello. So I really like the point of raising public awareness. I think particularly for governments, that pressure from the public is really what moves the dial. So where do you see, either in one act or among the actors, sort of the most potential for raising that awareness and societal acceptance for the mutual benefit of, using the parks collaboratively?
Great question. Thanks, Mike. Anyone have an answer to that? Avery first.
Yes, I think when it comes to that education piece, it's really who's on the ground and who's interacting with the public on a daily basis. And I think that can take a variety of a range of images, and that could be either something like what Jules mentioned, cultural experiences on the ground led by elders or First Nations leaders who are open to sharing their cultural experiences and the importance of the taking care of the land with the public. But from the perspective of the NGO specifically, there's a lot of opportunities to train volunteers to be out in the parks, be out on the land, educating people, sharing opportunities on how to more collaboratively support the landscape in a way that sustains it for the future. So I think there's a variety of perspectives in which we could look at it, and I think it doesn't necessarily have to come from government. I think we should be open to the different possibilities of supporting groups who are passionate, such as NGOs and First Nations, that are already taking those initiatives and taking those first steps to be real leaders. And I think we can follow in their footsteps.
Thanks, Avery, and I think Liz has something to add.
Yeah, just a little bit. Thanks, Avery, for that. Although we do know that boots on the ground is a great way to interact with people, but from the perspective of government, there's also a huge responsibility to help shape the vision and culture of the people that are delivering the work that we're supposed to be working towards reconciliation. So we get a little bit more in depth in this into the recommendations, but equally as important to include governments in that equation.
Thank you all, and thank you. Oh, one last.
One quick comment?
Yeah.
We have time?
We have time.
Thank you. Thanks, Taylor. I think, Mike, what you said about societal awareness, I think a lot of that work is being done right now. Governments are putting out master and park trail plans, and I see a lot of that societal awareness built into these plans, and kudos to those people who are involved in that work and who have been building those plans over the last so many years. It's great work. Implementing, I think, could use a lot more resources in bringing that societal awareness and these values for nature and land and holistic land use to fruition. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all for the questions and for our panelists for creating that whole picture of a very wholesome place. And I think any of us who have ecology backgrounds understand the importance of interconnectedness and not just trying to disconnect these parts of the land and the services they provide, but encouraging them to connect with one another, to connect to itself, and to create that whole system dynamic that we are a part of. And I think that cultural perspective shift is starting and has started, and through a number of modalities on the ground, through vision statements, through social media. And I think that's a really exciting thing for us, that our vision is starting, and we just want to encourage it to continue to pick up that momentum.
Okay, thanks so much, Taylor. So it's time now to really dig deep into the recommendations on how we intend to implement that vision. So through our process, we did identify a few areas where we felt opportunity existed to move towards this new vision of how parks and protected spaces could be more collaboratively managed in an inclusive way with First Nations. So our most dramatic recommendation is this idea that for the organizations involved to be able to actively and boldly work together and rebuild those structures. The existing structures, the way they are right now, limit the ability for these groups, these various people, to engage in a respectful and equitable way and integrate these values of the different partners and interests. So rather than renovating a system that's inherently kind of really limited with all this baggage of a colonial system, we recommend a paradigm shift. We recommend moving towards a system where there's a creation of this new multi-level, multi-governance organization that has a mandate to develop and implement and support this new co-management structure in the district municipality of Souk within the CRD. So what I'd like to do now is take a couple minutes to elaborate on these recommendations and how we've envisioned this to move forward. So I'd like to start off with Dan, if he could give us a little bit of a synopsis about collaborative land use planning.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Claire. So one of our recommendations was to incorporate more of a collaborative spirit into how we're planning and using the land. So the question that we asked ourselves is, how do our land use planning practices need to evolve to establish a land ethic that recognizes reconciliation in the standards and practices for the management of parks and beyond? I went over a bit about the concept of the land ethic, how it's a philosophy, it's a theoretical framework, and I believe that currently our philosophy around land use needs to change. We don't put enough value on intrinsic values and traditional and cultural uses. So current land use practices tend to develop land by creating value primarily for landowners. So this ties into our ownership structure of society while not acknowledging the value to the greater community. Through limited zoning structures such as commercial, residential, zoning pieces of land specifically for park spaces where we keep everything out and not allow many of the historically cultural values in. We are ignoring the intrinsic and alternative values of places, and as a result, reducing the net value that landscapes can provide to society. A lot of it comes from short-term thinking or the profitability of a household or a company. By this, we mean the fragmenting and parceling of land has not only reduced its value, while possibly sometimes increasing the short-term monetary value, but its ability to produce the necessaries of life for future generations. So that ties into more of a sustainable land use planning framework. As a result, we are now concerned with issues of contamination, pollution, invasive species, food security, and many other issues. So these are the externalities that have resulted from our land use planning practices. We need to incorporate these costs into how we are managing our land. So by connecting our land use practices to long-term values, this will align with the values and goals of reconciliation, primarily our connection to land and water, not only as a society, but as human beings. These practices can be changed to connect environmental values such as clean water and productive land to the ecological capacity of the ecosystems that we all rely on. What I'm really talking about is connecting landscapes instead of fragmenting and parceling them out to the highest bidder. By zoning land for development and justifying our current practices by setting aside parks and protected areas as places that keep human systems outside of them, we have degraded our human connection to nature. First Nations land ethic is the opposite. They acknowledge we are a part of nature, not apart from it. That is a major tenet that we need to incorporate into current land use practices and legislation. We need to incorporate this worldview if we are to create a sustainable society. I think just one more comment. What I heard from Craig's team working with Chief Planis from the Sauk Nation, they shared that connection with land and resources, and it shapes their language and culture. The land provides space for sharing knowledge of traditional practices to exercise elements of culture and traditional rights in the form of medicine harvesting and hunting. It is with these tenets in mind that we have highlighted opportunities to adopt practices which support the recognition of First Nations' relationship with land and water and their associated rights.
Thanks so much, Dan. Is there anyone on the panel who would like to take a quick moment to elaborate on any of the recommendations with respect to land use planning? Okay, in that case, I'd like to move on to allow Craig to talk about prioritizing capacity.
Thank you, Claire. There are a number of things that we can do that our cohort as a whole came up with among the 5 teams to really prioritize capacity. Among them, advocate for the creation of an endowment fund that supports projects taking place within current or future parks and protected areas that follow the pillars of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Provide funding and support to ensure dedicated staff and resource capacity within First Nations. This was an issue that, as Dan maybe just briefly touched on, that did come up in our interview with Chief Gordon Planis and Tribal Council Member Alan Planis at the Sauk First Nation. They really would like to have the resources and staff to engage in stewardship of their traditional lands and take a more active role in their management. But right now, that capacity is unfortunately lacking. Beyond parks, connect utilities to First Nations from neighboring neighboring municipalities, and where desired, to address basic infrastructure needs such as water, sewer, waste collection. Internet access is also an issue in many of our First Nations, and that needs to be addressed. Another issue that came up in our interview with Chief Gordon Planis was the idea of culture camps, as well as day hikes and things like that into CRD lands and provincial parks within their territory. Culture camps, defined broadly, can include a number of things. It can include younger age children going in to these lands with elders or other members of the First Nation and exploring some traditional practices. It might include actual overnight or even longer stays into some of these lands to really explore the culture and resources that previously have sustained First Nations throughout history. So that is an idea, I think, worthy of exploring. And there are a number of opportunities for funding, I think, that have gone untapped. Van City has in the past funded Feasting for Change, for example, that brought First Nations together to enjoy a feast of traditional foods that were harvested from this area and sustained the First Nations in this area historically. Bringing in Van City maybe for the culture camp idea and day hikes and, or other funders to support that would be something that would greatly increase capacity as well. Just really, it all comes down to building relationships and trust. That's what the reconciliation process is all about. So, exploring more opportunities such as memorandums of understanding and co-management agreements, such as what the Sauk First Nation currently enjoys with the CRD, with the Spring Salmon Place campground. Exploring those opportunities to their fullest, really engaging in dialogue with First Nations about that and how they can take advantage of managing campgrounds or other sites cooperatively with the CRD, with the provincial parks, and actually maybe getting some economic benefit that will over time help build that capacity within their communities.
Thanks so much, Craig. Taylor, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and great specific examples, Craig, but I just wanted to point out to everyone that across the board, every group or organization that we reached out to mentioned capacity in some form, like, oh, we want to do this, we're mandated to do this, or, we think this would be great, but we're limited in capacity. And so as a class, we were kind of picking that apart and like, how can that be? How can nobody have capacity? So I think what we decided was, how can we reframe that? How can we say it's not necessarily a limited capacity, but maybe just looking at reprioritizing and being able to empower the employees that want to explore these issues, the NGOs, the volunteers that want to be engaged and work on the relationships that we identified as being so important, spending time with people on a personal level, and just making that a priority in some way. So making the capacity for it.
Absolutely, that's a great point. I'd like to ask Alyssa now to speak about increased awareness and social acceptance.
Thanks, Claire. So we kind of briefly touched on this in one of the question periods previously, but right now, joint efforts to increase social awareness and acceptance in First Nations culture, history, and traditions, and the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are essential to reconciliation in the region and further. Within our current regional taxation and government structures, public citizens comprise a large collective voice regarding regional decision-making, and will be central to supporting and exemplifying reconciliation efforts. Without an appreciation and understanding for First Nations history, culture, and traditions, it's unlikely that the public will take up involvement in initiative towards reconciliation or prioritize decisions to enable it. We heard from many sources during our research that a deeper understanding between all members of society is still needed. So 5 examples of opportunities to increase social awareness and acceptance can include, number 1, all levels of government, leading by way of example and creating a culture shift within their organizations. This could mean expanding the culture training across all staff in the province of BC, not just within the BC parks, as well as implementing training within regional and local governments. This could also include encouraging the increased use of elements of First Nations arts in parks and communities, inviting First Nations to add their stories and names to parks, and continuing to include and enhance First Nations culture, history, and storytelling in parks and educational programs, Particularly, we know tourism was one of the fastest growing industries in BC right now. So we have a great opportunity to reach not only people here, but people across the world and people across Canada. And fourth, we can invite and support First Nations to deliver culture camps, as Craig referred to earlier, and guided day hikes featuring the native plants, animals, and design designated culture sites on traditional land. A recent example of this collaborative collaboration would be a recent signing of a memorandum of understanding between the Indigenous Tourism BC and British Columbia Assembly of First Nations. So they've agreed to collaborate with each other over tourism, business, education, and government organizations to promote economic development in Indigenous communities across the province. And lastly, they can partner and develop linkages with NGOs to increase the awareness of traditions and rights of First Nations, as Avery mentioned earlier.
Great, thanks. And with no further comments from the panel on that one, I'd like to invite Jules to talk about building trust and relationships.
Thanks, Claire. And thanks for everyone for kind of leading us on this journey of multiple actions and recommendations. And I just want to point out they all support each other. So we're not proposing these recommendations in isolation, but actually as a suite of recommended actions and things to implement together. Maybe not all at once, but on a spectrum of all these things complement each other and aren't isolated. So I'm going to speak a little bit about recommendations in terms of building trust and relationships. So this was consistently cited as sort of like the common underlying theme of like if we only had better trust and stronger relationships, we could just move forward. So we'd like to propose sort of a practical way to advance building trust and developing stronger relationships between communities. Specifically, there's a unique opportunity for local governments as they live essentially next door to First Nations communities. It's on the ground, face-to-face, daily interactions are possible. In contrast to the province, who sort of is at this 30,000, height elevation view, sort of that broad view, as opposed to on the ground, working on the neighborly level. And so project level, issue-specific partnerships were consistently cited by interviewees within this research as a key leverage point for building trust. Trust takes time to build. Some would say it takes a lot of tea drinking before you develop a meaningful relationship. You actually have to sit down and engage in conversation and put in the time and effort. But trusting relationships, they're essential to creating positive change. And there's formal ways of doing that, and there's informal ways of doing that. And what we're proposing is to not discredit the informal ways of building trust and relationships and actually amplifying and elevating informal structures for creating dialogue as a way to deepen trust and build relationships. Formal tables, such as, say, treaty negotiation tables, tend to be slower, they're more rigid, they're more encumbered by legal processes. People are a little bit nervous to misstep or things get tied up in the legalese. You're less able to sort of talk on more of an informal, conversational, person-to-person basis in some ways. So maybe peripheral to these official processes, to formal legislation, to regulatory relationships, how can we create space for ongoing dialogue, trust building, and informal partnerships to advance reconciliation? And what we're proposing is the concept of an informal but highly nimble forum we're calling the Transformative Reconciliation Network. And this has enough structure to guide its function, but few enough constraints to allow the participants to develop innovation by responding to shared opportunities in a non-linear and novel ways that are simply not possible through formal, more rigid structures. The idea is that the Transformative Reconciliation Network may be established in a pilot format within the District Municipality of Souk, within the CRD, particular to this case study area. It would serve as a collaborative working body that merges the culture of traditional talking circles with that of practical working groups. Open dialogue, candid discussion, storytelling, sharing and listening to perspectives, continuous learning, and the pursuit of common ground are key tenets of this group. Sharing food, song, dance may well be a part of it. In this circle, everyone is equal. speaking from both their hearts and their minds is encouraged. We envision this as a collection of individuals and representatives from diverse perspectives, different agencies, different groups and communities, rights holders and stakeholders working together, focusing on how to act upon the commitments to reconciliation and developing shared values, shared priorities, and a concept of mutual benefit. This collaborative group could focus on parks and protected areas as kind of a gateway focus to test this concept, because there's so many other issues that need to be discussed within that type of forum, but potentially as sort of a focusing element, parks and protected areas could be an area of focus to initiate that. The participants are compelled to be there, in part by the legal commitments within the forthcoming Reconciliation Act, but in part because they care about each other and they're prioritizing building trust between organizations. So while taking the time needed to develop essential formal agreements, it's important to create space and a network for ongoing dialogue and the development of interim measures on matters that are of interest to all parties, while also continuing to build an understanding and respect across cultures. This is essentially a foundation upon which to build to further develop a decision-making structure, which my colleague Avery will expand on for us here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Avery, or Jules, sorry. Avery, I'd like it if you could take a moment to maybe give the audience an idea about the analogy we've been using to explain this paradigm shift that could support co-management, reconciliation, and decolonization.
Great. Thanks, ladies, and thanks, everyone, for letting me go last. So hopefully you have lots of great questions to follow, especially all you students. I'm sure you've all been preparing. So I just want to take a moment to build off of Julie's recommendations. I really loved her concept of building that informal, transformative reconciliation network that includes that relationship and trust building. And that I think that we can use that as the foundation to build a future formal relationship structure. So I want you to join me in imagining building a house on the foundation of Julie's transformative reconciliation network that she mentioned that we came up with as a class. Thank you. It's ours. And that we would use that foundation to develop a more collaborative decision-making entity for which we have not determined a name as exciting as the one that Julie mentioned for the more informal structure. So to give you some context, I think it's important to note that a major barrier to the development and successful implementation of co-management as a governing practice is that any attempt at this currently involves one party joining the other under a pre-existing structure. Using the analogy of a house, this is like moving into your partner's house. So this is in opposition, we believe, to the spirit and intent behind co-management, where governing parties are equal partners sharing in the responsibilities of that group. A system where one party must join the other or be nested under an existing structure is decidedly colonial, especially when it is the First Nations being invited to join a government at any level or any table, even as a decision maker. So rather than renovate your partner's home, or in our case, as Claire mentioned, a system laden with baggage and broken linkages, the paradigm shift that we are proposing as a class is the collaborative creation of a new house, or a multi-member, multi-governance level entity with a mandate to develop, implement, and support the co-management structure, specifically in our case pertaining to parks. Our intent is that First Nations and all levels of government would participate together and collectively vision and form the structure of what this new house could look like. In our design of this new structure, we envision that other agencies, such as the NGOs we spoke to, public organizations, private organizations, community groups, would be a part of building this new house with us. We are recommending that a formal agreement would be signed in this case, and between all the members engaged, and this could be used to support the walls of consensus-based decision-making. This form of delegated authority would play the role of breaking down historical power imbalances and ensure that the frame of the house is equitable and collaboratively developed. So this formal structure built on the foundation of the transformative reconciliation network that Julie spoke to is the need in the near future to make equally distributed decisions through a structure where everyone has a fair opportunity to make decisions via consensus. In other words, everyone has to agree whether or not they want carpet or hardwood in the bedroom. So this decision-making entity can be used to support parks and protected areas specifically and the creation of a more collaborative management structure. But we also believe that this could potentially be a pilot that could be used in other situations and cases across the province. So a couple quick recommendations on what we want to use to build our house. We believe that a collaborative decision-making entity that we are proposing would be best suited to have an NGO-like structure in which they are working more collaboratively on a common cause. We also like the idea of a council or a board structure where membership could be used to support an even representation for all parties involved. We like the idea of a core membership of keystone groups that hold decision-making status. This included in our research and idea-making structure, First Nations, all levels of government, NGOs, community groups, private, public organizations, and other invited guests who could help provide more information and advice, but don't necessarily have to be a part of that formal decision-making process. The utility of non-decision-making members would be their freedom to engage in innovative ways outside rigid institutional processes and add capacity through the foundation in which Julie spoke to in those informal relationships that would have already been built. We suggest that this new formal entity host a series of open forums on key topics, such as the co-management of parks, or bring stakeholders and public together to find new ways to collaborate. Another opportunity for this entity would be to create training opportunities, educational opportunities, and to provide support to things such as the arts, literature, music, and more informal things such as signage or collaboration around different information dissemination. So in summary, we imagine that this entity would grow, it would change, and it would remain fluid as society does. But even as you renovate your house on an ongoing basis, the most important thing is that the foundation always remains solid.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Avery. To sum that up, I think to pull it together nicely, what we're really trying to get at here is the idea of building a new system where we are prioritizing relationships and prioritizing collaboration and finding ways to speak each other's languages in new ways. Because me speaking to anybody on this panel, we already speak the same language. We understand each other. And what we really need to do here is make sure that those who we wish to collaborate with, make sure that we all kind of have that common foundation and that common understanding of where we're trying to go and how we're going to get there, and make sure that everybody is at the table equally. That's really the crux of what we're getting at here, is that fundamental collaboration that makes sure that all parties are equal and understood and valued. So with that, what I'd really like to do now, we have about 25 minutes left in the session today. I'm hoping we could have a conversation. I'd like to open the floor to the audience to start posing some questions, and our group here will do the best they can to answer and elaborate on anything that you're looking at here. We're going to try and keep it to 2 to 3 people answering at a time, just so that we can get as many questions through as possible. And if you have any follow-ups or if you'd like to chat more, I definitely encourage, I don't know, I've heard that shakedowns are a really good networking opportunity, so maybe we can chat outside. Okay. With that said, does anybody want to kick us off? Tyler? Thanks. Come on, guys, don't give Tyler all the airtime.
Thank you. That was a beautiful synopsis of the house analogy. Thank you for that. I really like it. It was nice. I guess maybe I'm gonna ask a little bit more about that. Who leads the charge on this? Like, what's the first step? How do we start? Is there anyone in particular? This is obviously, it sounds like it's an everyone job, but where do we start?
Avery?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the foundation essentially is the building those informal relationships initially, but I do believe that the start needs to be the building of a new entity, and I believe that entity needs to be a nonprofit in nature. And I do not like the name nonprofit because of what it implies. So I think it should be something more along the lines of a social profit because of what I mentioned earlier about nonprofits filling a social gap. So therefore, they should be social profits. Anyways, I think that to create a new social profit, it would be give an opportunity to have a clear new mission or mandate. So if we were to give it over to a pre-existing entity, there's already that understanding of what they want to do, what their purpose or their mission is in society. So the building of a new organization that I like to look at as more neutral in structure and more of a moderator or facilitator of dialogue would be the best way to move that forward. And in my nonprofit experience, that is something we're working on right now, is bringing together all these different players to make collaborative decisions around how we can better govern our society. And so far it's working. So in my situation, it's around water, but yeah, I believe it's just such a great model because everyone has to be equal at the table. There's no one gets a more important vote or say in the decisions that are made. And when everyone's at the table agreeing, then that decision that comes out of it has a higher weight or value when it goes forward to politicians or delegates that have decision-making power. So
that's great. Thanks, Avery. And I think Dan had something to chip in there.
Yeah, thank you, Avery. Just 2 quick points. I think that it is happening already, and I believe this because I went and talked with a member of the Souk District municipality, and they informed us that their mayor is having talks with First Nations chief. So I'm hopeful that there's a relationship being built there. I've heard other stories from many of you about there are initiatives, so it's starting. That's my first point. Second point is we're doing it right now. I've learned so much about reconciliation coming into this project. I knew it existed, but now I have a deeper understanding of it. Now I can go into my community and talk about it in a much more informed and intelligent way, and I hope that everyone else here will do the same thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I think Julie had one more quick thing to add, and then we'll move on to a new question.
Thank you. So one quick thing, just right to your point of where do we start? And I think if we think of it as we start on the land, and we start together, as Avery described, but on the land. And I think that helps us connect to a sense of place. You know, if we're starting in a boardroom somewhere, whose boardroom is it, right? Maybe we'd be starting on the First Nations banned lands or reserve lands or within their community. But again, then it puts onus on financial resources, maybe of one party as opposed to the collective. So maybe it's sort of like this, a way of meeting on the land, and the land is not just one square box of one park. The land is everywhere. So if it could be a fluid way of meeting that sort of passes through the different entities that are working collaboratively together, and that's a way to pool resources. So it's not on one organization, say CRD, you have to foot this entire bill of all the meetings we have yet to come, but sort of break down those kind of structures of power of who's footing the bill and say, you know, we're going to rotate. We're going to meet in a provincial park this month. Next month, we're going to meet in the district of Souk, like right on the beach. And then we're going to maybe meet, you know, within the community of the Sauk First Nation. So I think the ideas or the concepts of meeting on the land and then sort of breaking down the structures of where and who to make it more equitable as what was described would be a good first step.
Yeah, absolutely, Julie. And I think also the most critical piece here is relationship building. So when we're talking about a starting place, what we really need to consider is building that trust and building that relationship as a critical first step. And using that informal network as a jumping off point to embed more collaborative decision-making process as time goes on and as those relationships kind of build and evolve and develop. And there are so many more benefits, as Avery mentioned, than just economic. And when you say nonprofit, it implies that the only valid benefit is economic. And I think what we're proposing here is to elevate those social and cultural benefits as well. So I'd like to open the floor if there's anybody else who has another question. Joy, and then we will get Megan after.
Just a quick one. So one thing that we haven't really discussed yet, but I think ties in really nicely with a lot of the work that we've done as a class, is how does this this whole UNDRIP and reconciliation process feed into tackling some of the challenges of climate change and loss of biodiversity?
I think Taylor, and then Craig.
Hello. Yeah, I think that's a really important point to be looking at, and how human rights, which UNDRIP is, basic human rights for all people, equitably across the board. I think it builds upon the idea that it's not a zero-sum game, and that the more we empower everyone and bring up those that are struggling in one way or another and are all enabled to play on an equal playing field, we can support one another with those greater visions like sustainability and protecting the environment and being good stewards of this land. So I think in part it's empowering our neighbors and our partners and bringing everyone up to a level where they can participate fully and meaningfully in the way that they want to. So that's what I see.
And thinking about the goals of reconciliation of self-determination, self-sufficiency in particular. Self-sufficiency, I mean, I think we do see an excellent example with the Sauk First Nation, as well as with the community of Colwood here where we reside, in terms of the solar initiative that First Nation undertook, which is very consistent. It's modern technology, but it's very consistent with First Nations values, and I would say with the values and goals set forth in UNDRIP. And then there's the Colwood Solar Initiative, which ended in 2015 as funding expired, but I believe it was around 1,000 homes in this neighborhood that were actually equipped with solar panels as a result of that. So there's opportunities for those kinds of initiatives, I think, that are very consistent. And of course, these First Nations have a long-standing interest in preserving these areas. I mentioned the Smokehouse Lakes at the beginning of my comments. These are areas, Boulder Lake's another one, that are sacred to the Sauk First Nation. But every First Nation has places like that within their territory that they want to see preserved for their children and grandchildren and future generations, so that they can continue the cultural practices, begin rebuilding some of the cultural practices that maybe have faded as a result of residential schools and other things that have happened in their past. So there is not, as far as First Nations are concerned, certainly bringing them into this process would enhance sustainability in my view, because they perhaps more than anyone have huge incentives in order to protect these resources moving forward.
Thanks, Craig. I'd like to add, what? Oh, and Liz would like to chime in, sorry.
Yeah, just something to add to what Craig was saying. The culture of sustainability and living off the land and people embracing that in society. I know for myself, sustainability wasn't really something I considered until my early 20s in school, and it's just not it wasn't part of growing up in life. So to Joy's point, embracing UNDRIP brings that reality back, and it has for me as well, connecting us to our goal of sustainability and being able to survive on this planet together. So I just think it's important that other people understand that and can connect with that and understand that it's important and that we are all healthier and happier for it.
Great, thanks a lot. I'll pass the floor to Megan, and then I saw Kelly's hand after that. Yeah.
Hey guys. So recognizing that I think the suggestions here pertain to all parks and protected areas within the CRD, but Julie, you did mention a case study area, and I was just wondering if anybody wanted to expand a little bit upon, what parks in particular, are there areas that we as a class looked at that, we see as maybe like good sort of opportunities and physical places to start?
Does anyone want to touch on that? Sure, we can start with Taylor.
I'll just answer briefly, but I think some of the commonly looked at examples of co-management or better integrated management between First Nations and governments, Haida Gwaii, Guayhanas National Park, as well as the Niska Lava Beds Memorial Park, which is co-managed with the provincial parks and the Niska people. So I think those are both examples of some early nations that really we're pushing hard to work with governments and have their say in that co-management, and we just want to highlight that we need to enable that process and make sure that that's available to all different nations that are interested.
Great, thanks. And Julie?
Thanks. So yeah, to your point, to expand on maybe case studies from elsewhere, which Taylor alluded to, I think coming back to maybe what we did as a class and as a research project collectively was we were faced with, okay, the geographic area of CRD. And there's loads of parks and there's loads of different stakeholders. There's many different First Nations. And so we thought, okay, we could look at the entire geographic area of the CRD. That's one way to do it. But I think collectively as a class, we thought about, how can we ground this in maybe a more localized area that could be sort of like a pilot area within the CRD. And due to some connections that classmates had with the Sauk First Nation and some of our early research on what might be an interesting place to start with our cohort's case study, that's what kind of narrowed us to sort of the traditional territories of the Sauk First Nation, generally that part of the Capital Regional District. And so when talking about specific parks within that area, you could speak to the regional parks that are managed by the CRD, C2C being one example of that regional trail system and park. There's the Sauk Potholes, which have a regional district management piece as well as a provincial park management piece. And then there's other provincial parks as well, like the Sauk Mountain Provincial Park, which was identified as, interestingly, a priority from the Sauk First Nation perspective of a piece of land where they would like to engage more in co-management and potentially economic development and other uses. And when we raised that with our BC Parks interviews, they hadn't been prioritizing that area at all. And so we phrased the question, if the Sauk First Nation was to bring up a particular provincial park as a priority to sort of exercise co-management or engage in project level partnerships, what would that look like for BC Parks? And they expressed a willingness in the sense of, if there's priorities brought forward from particular nations on provincial parks where they want to engage in project partnerships, there's a willingness to kind of elevate that to the top of their priority list. And a key distinction I'll point out before we move on is just they particularly pointed out, they developed 40 plus collaborative management agreements, formal documents that actually more so sit on the shelf than are implemented on the ground in practice. And they pointed to the fact that if there's kind of issue-specific on-the-ground initiatives that are brought forward, and there's this momentum of people who want to engage, on projects within parks, so First Nations bring those priorities to them, that's a way to quickly engage and do some work without sort of the slow process of doing a formal management agreement. So I think there's provincial parks in the Sauk traditional territory, there's regional parks, there's district municipality of Sauk parks, and loads of other areas to focus on, but that was sort of our nested case study within the CRD for this class project.
Great. And I think to summarize, it's important to acknowledge too that we only had ultimately, when it came down to it, about 2.5 weeks to really dive into this research. So that's only scratching the surface. And we had to be very cognizant of that and make sure that we pull off our we don't bite off more that we can chew and make sure that we have a manageable scope. And so that's why we kind of really drilled down into a very specific area within the CRD. Kelly, I want to hear your question, but I think we need to... Okay, Craig would like to chime in quickly, and then I think I missed a hand over here, so I'd like from Stephen, and then Kelly will move on to you. Thanks.
Just real quickly, Jules already brought up the Sauk Mountain Provincial Park, but the provincial, the BC strategy, zoning and strategy document, I believe it's called, from 2008, actually refers to exploring giving that park to the CRD. And I just want to throw out there that I think an alternative might be the CRD endorsing giving that park to the Sauk First Nation. And that might put a little bit of pressure on BC Parks to explore another alternative to that, because those are crown lands as opposed to fee simple lands, and so there's fewer issues there in terms of co-management opportunities or tribal park opportunities, or whatever direction that the affected parties want to go in that. But I think that's a better alternative maybe than giving it to the CRD to become part of the C2C. It is actually given to the Sauk First Nation. So.
Thanks, Craig. And Stephen, sorry, I don't think we've had the pleasure of meeting yet, but please, the floor is yours.
Yeah.
So it's a very bold vision, very well done. I like the format and all really well done from all the different participants. Your comment actually kind of leads into where my question was going. The CRD has a bit of a patchwork of ownership, just like the lands, not the CRD organization. Right. In our area, it's very, you mentioned colonial, there's a very land titles, there's surveying, and there's patchwork of ownership. So there's the different groups that own it. Do you foresee the First Nations would also contribute land to this this holistic format? They own some beautiful lands that we don't get to go to so much, and maybe it might be the kind of the equality that we're kind of talking about. They could also participate and put their lands into the mix as well.
Sure. Would anybody like to touch on that? Dan? Oh, I thought I saw your hand, sorry. Craig, do you want to chime in, and then maybe Jules?
Right. First, let me say that First Nations giving lands or sharing lands or opening up some lands to access that maybe the public at large doesn't currently enjoy access to, or as great access as First Nations do, did not come up in our conversation. So I want to make clear I'm not speaking or in any way implying that I have any great insights into how they would react to that. I do think that they would react very positively, however, to being part of the discussion. I think trust and relationship building did come up in our conversation with Gordon Planis and Alan Planis, and just that trust, frankly, is lacking for a variety of reasons. I don't want to point fingers at anybody and say it's any particular group or organization's fault. It's just there's a variety of historical reasons that trust is lacking. And so, somebody mentioned, it takes a lot of you have to drink a lot of tea to build that trust. And I think the paradigm shift and the transformative reconciliation network that we are recommending is a great way to sit down and start drinking that tea and breaking some bread together and just talking and bringing up that issue. It would be an excellent opportunity to bring up that issue. And it needs to be a safe space where all the parties can bring up their grievances, can bring up their concerns, can bring up the reasons that trust is lacking, and so that those issues can be addressed up front. And I definitely don't think that there's an interest in excluding the public from areas like the Smokehouse Lakes if they gained title to that. They just feel like, there have been bike trails, there have been other things, other developments that have been put up in that area where they're just, after the fact or after the plan has kind of already been developed and the maps are all drawn, it's like, hey, what do you think about this? As opposed to going to them first and saying, we're thinking about developing this land in this way. What do you think? How can we develop it in a way? Are we building a bike path in an area that's really culturally important to you, right through the middle of it? Or are we avoiding, areas that are culturally sensitive and things like that? Those kinds of dialogues are not happening first. They're kind of happening after the maps are all drawn from their perspective and everything is all planned out, and there's been a lot of meetings held at various levels of government, and then it's like, oh, by the way, we're here to consult. We've done all this planning. So I think that the proposal that we're coming up with or recommending here is just an excellent way to just sit down without having any of these legal concerns and things like that, where they can just sit down and talk and listen to one another. So, yeah.
Thanks, Craig, and I think Taylor'd like to chime in.
I think that's an excellent and a very scary question. And from my perspective, I think that it would take a lot of time to be able to come forward to a space where we would be able, myself speaking from the colonial perspective, to ask that. And I think that's where truth and reconciliation and why that's such a pertinent part of this conversation is that we need to remember, we need to understand the history of this country and how that's impacted people, specifically First Nations, on this land base. And the way that we have conducted ourselves in coming here has put them on that defensive and put them into the headspace and the need to be able to support themselves and survive, to be protective of their lands and territories. And I would say it would be a bit foolish to think that that's gone already because of the work that we're starting to put forward. And I think it would take a lot of time and trust building and the incentive and the action that backs our mandates and our UNDRIP and our efforts in reconciliation before we would be able to even ask that question. So I think the more we can show and demonstrate earnest and genuine collaborative efforts with First Nations, maybe there would be an openness to start having that discussion, and once they're valued as equals, that might become a reality. But I think that's far in the future at this point.
Yeah, absolutely, Taylor. That building relationships is definitely a fundamental piece in building that trust over time. And I think the vision is to start off with that idea of creating space for everybody to participate where they feel comfortable and at the level that they feel comfortable. And hopefully, like, as we build that relationship, that can grow and evolve and change as people's priorities change and as people's comfort hopefully increases with the process of that collaborative management framework. Kelly's been very patient. I'd love to hear from you.
Just a suggestion, not necessarily a question. And this speaks to CRD, the province, all the municipalities, and it's expanding on something Taylor said earlier about building capacity. And I feel like it might fit into building that informal network. And I'll challenge the government organizations to look within their own organization and find out whose heart is already in this. Who already believes in this process, and identify those people. It doesn't matter if you're in accounting or if you're a parking attendant or where you are. There's people that are the thousands of people throughout these organizations that you're going to identify. I don't know, maybe 20, maybe 500 people who already want to feel this and want to do something to make this change. So look within your organization and identify those people and bring them together in that formal network, and then empower them to make that change. Because right now we're telling people, or we're volunteering people, or voluntold them to go and have these meetings. But I imagine it would be a very powerful meeting to know that the parking attendant or the accountant is sitting in the room with First Nations people who are there with heart only. They're only there for the heart, and that's how we can build that relationship instead of bringing it top down and creating these organizations, these structures. So I would challenge those organizations to look inward and identify those people and empower those people.
Thanks, Kelly. I think Avery'd like to respond quickly, and then I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, thanks.
I see your hand here.
Thanks for saying that, Kelly. And I just want to add on, I know Alyssa did mention some of the training that is happening within government, and then I also want to speak to what Dan said about his deeper understanding of truth and reconciliation because of this education we are receiving and being open to as professionals. And I just want to advocate from the nonprofit perspective, one of the groups that we did look into, the Indigenous Perspective Society, that offers another opportunity, in my opinion, a group like theirs, to go into government and maybe give people an opportunity to see if the potential to connect on a deeper level with First Nations is something they are interested in and maybe just have not had the opportunity to do. And so, for example, that Indigenous Perspective Society, one of the things they do is training on perspectives and specific consultation to deepen the understanding of Indigenous perspectives, cultural differences, and the need for self-determination. So something like that, having maybe more informal or formal workshops within those colonial structures to give people an opportunity to learn, is this something I am connected with? I've just never had the opportunity to learn about. So just to build off of what you said, I think that's a very poignant comment. So thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of that idea of our hope is that people will hear this and be able to disseminate it and call their peers and colleagues to action and continue that momentum forward. And so with that said, I have one final question over here from one of our guests, and then we will move on.
Thank you, guys. That was a great presentation. I know that the scope of the presentation is really focused on co-management, but I wondered if anyone could speak to potential, because co-management is under this construct of colonial ownership, and so I wondered if you could speak to some new novel approaches to conservation and protection that don't necessarily fall under current structures. So instead of looking at co-management of existing protected lands, what are some other things you may have come across in terms of new novel approaches to protection?
Anyone? I can maybe start off. I think ultimately what we're trying to get at here is the idea, like, as you mentioned, that the existing framework doesn't really allow for the type of management that we're proposing here. It doesn't really allow for that structure where these parties can come to the table and decide together where should we be focusing our efforts? And I think it comes back to that piece that I mentioned at the very beginning in that story, that idea that First Nation communities don't typically use the term park. They think about nature as a whole, and the way that they interact with nature and the way that nature provides for them in return. And there needs to be a way to embed that, because using parks as a jurisdiction to just protect little pockets of land here and there isn't sufficient. We need to embed that within our entire system, and so that's why we focused on that idea of using parks almost as a pilot in a way to say, okay, well, how can we shift that conversation and what could it look like? And in answer to your question, I don't think that we did come across a specific thing to solve that, because it's very novel. Like in the colonial system, it's just not something that people are doing. They're not considering how to move out of that system. They're just kind of doing the best they can within it. So I think what we're suggesting is something that isn't really being done. It's big, and there's lots to consider there, but I think that our hope is that we can move away from that very colonial, rigid, top-down structure to kind of bring from the bottom, bring the perspectives of everybody involved to consider how we can kind of reduce those barriers and remove those artificial boundaries around very specific places, and embed that protection of nature within the system as a bottom line. I think Kelly had his hand waving like this. He might want to chime in. I don't know if you feel comfortable with that, and then we'll open it up to one more comment from the panel if anyone has it.
My thoughts on the answer to that question. I think it's taking the worldview and kind of who's leading this charge globally, and I see where it would align with the indigenous wisdom and knowledge is bold step for sure, but for the CRD, the province, the federal government, and the local municipalities to embrace the rights of nature, to forget about the human construct that we have, but apply the rights of nature to a certain area that would allow then the First Nations to speak on behalf. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the rights of nature, but it's amazing that entire paradigm shift that now we have given those rights to Mother Nature and to herself. And I think it would be an international success if we could get to that in the local area for sure.
Thanks. Great. I think we had one more comment on this side, and then we'll move on. I think Dan. Oh, you're giving it to Jules. Okay, let's hear it, Jules.
Thank you. Yeah, hopefully I can telepathically, channel what Dan is thinking and do a 2-for-1 here. But I think, co-management, even in itself, the term, it was unpacked by some of our interviewees as it's not co-management, but collaborative management. And then it kind of prompts us to kind of unpack, well, what does it mean to collaborate? And I think Kelly's comment of what compels people to come to a space where they're willing to engage with one another. And actually, it's more compelling to come with your heart than it is just simply from your mind. And so if people are compelled through, maybe they've been exposed to interactions like this and they've been seeded with there's another way of looking at things, or maybe they've just been seeded with, things aren't working the way they currently are. And there's this sort of just gut instinct or intuition that we can do things differently. And I think if we combine that sort of approach that Kelly introduced of if the people who are compelled to be there with their heart show up, and if there's sort of enough of a structure to provide space or hold space for those dialogues, but not too much constraints that sort of rein in the dialogue and sort of dampen innovation, then I think that would be a really good combination of factors to answer that question. Because I think that question has to be answered by the collective. And we could pull some examples, and I think the rights of a river and the rights of the trees, and kind of bringing that more into our way of viewing and managing the environment is a good first step. But I think it's if we unpack that term collaboration and what compels people to come to the table and use some of these thoughts that we've generated today, then maybe we can get closer to specific tools that you're seeking, yeah.
Thanks so much, Jules. And I'd like to thank everybody so much for their contributions today and for engaging in this dialogue with us. I'd like to pass it off to Taylor for some closing comments before we get rained out of here.
Thank you. And I'll just add one last thing to that final question. Now I have the mic. Great question. And again, it's really hard, and it feels like we want to go somewhere and we're just not sure how to start. And we're suggesting you just start. But I also, back to my little nerdy brain, we've been talking a lot about Holling's panarchy loop in class. And so talking about how we retain the elements that serve us, that are from this current system or structure we're in, and bring them to a different level and create a new system by bringing those elements with us and letting go of the ones that don't serve us. And that starts with the dialogue with everyone that we feel needs to be heard at that table, with the equal decision on which elements we bring with us and which we let go of. And using that protecting, overarching system that we have now and using it to create the one that we're envisioning or imagining. So thanks. So what we hope we've conveyed to you today is that our report, which will be forwarded to you by Derek, really imagines a future in which all the communities within the Capital Regional District have embraced uncertainty, the ambiguity, and the discomfort to create an entirely new culture of possibility. So borrowing a phrase from one of our textbooks, we're asking everyone here today to join us in embarking upon a journey of getting to maybe. By taking the first step with us, you have opened your hearts and minds to possibility and embraced a future of honest dialogue in which the highest barriers between us, our own individual fears and prejudices, have been set aside in the name of reconciliation and genuine partnership. You've entered a landscape in which vulnerability is cherished above power and hope is valued above cynicism. This story ends with you witnessing cultural practices we used to fear had been forgotten, and walking together through the woods with brothers and sisters, exchanging wisdom, both old and new. And if you can imagine that, you're already halfway there. So thank you so much for your time today, for your questions and your engagement. We invite you to continue the conversation, approach us. Hopefully we can mingle a bit before we're kicked outside. But again, thank you so much for joining us and being part of this process.